Imagine standing on top of Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth. Now imagine taking the entire mountain from its summit to its deepest rock and dropping it into one place in the ocean. It would disappear completely. Not only that, around 2 kilometers of water would still cover its summit. That place is called the Mariana Trench, and at the very bottom of it lies a point known as Challenger Deep, the deepest known place in all of Earth's oceans. It is roughly 10,934 meters below sea level, a place where sunlight never reaches, where the temperature is close to freezing, and where the pressure is more than 1,000 times stronger than the pressure we live with at the surface, enough to crush most machines, let alone a human being. But the strangest part is not just how deep it is. The real story is this: how did humans even discover that this place existed? And how did it go from being a terrifying number written down by sailors using an old rope to a world visited by humans and robots? A place where scientists discovered life and even pollution created by mankind itself. This is the journey of the Mariana Trench, from the HMS Challenger to the deepest place ever reached by a human on Earth. Before we begin, there is something important to understand. The Mariana Trench is not a small hole in the ocean floor. It is a massive scar in the western Pacific Ocean, east of the Mariana Islands, stretching for nearly 2,550 kilometers. In some places, it is around 69 kilometers wide, and the reason it exists is just as terrifying as its shape. Deep beneath the ocean, the Pacific Plate is slowly moving and sinking beneath the Philippine Sea Plate. It is as if an entire piece of Earth's crust is being forced down into the planet, centimeter by centimeter, over millions of years. That process created a trench deeper than any valley or crater we know on land, and the deepest part inside it is not the entire trench itself. It is a relatively small area near its southern end called Challenger Deep, and that name comes from an old British ship. In 1872, a British Royal Navy ship called HMS Challenger set sail, but it was not a war mission, not an invasion, and not a trade voyage. It was one of the first major scientific expeditions created to study the oceans. At that time, the ocean was still mostly a blue mystery. Humans knew its coastlines and ports, but what existed beneath the surface was almost completely unknown. In fact, many scientists believed that life could not survive in the deepest parts of the ocean. They thought the seafloor was a dark, lifeless wasteland. But the crew of the Challenger wanted to find the truth. They measured water temperature, they collected sea creatures, they gathered samples from the seabed, and most importantly, they measured the depth. Their method was incredibly primitive compared to what we have today. A very long rope with a heavy metal weight at the end was lowered from the ship until it touched the ocean floor. In March 1875, the Challenger was crossing the western Pacific. Strong and confusing winds pushed it away from its planned route to Guam, sending it into waters no one truly understood. At research station number 225 on March 23, 1875, the crew began lowering the rope, meter after meter, 1 kilometer, then 2, then 5, then more. And eventually, they recorded a number so unbelievable that they repeated the measurement just to make sure it was real. 4,475 fathoms, around 8,184 meters. It was the deepest measurement recorded during the entire expedition around the world. That number was not the true depth of the deepest point, but it was the first clear clue that something enormous and frightening was hiding beneath those waters. At the time, nobody knew that the ship had passed close to the deepest place in all the oceans. Years later, other ships returned to the region. In 1899, the American ship USS Nero recorded a depth of around 9,636 meters. And in the decades that followed, measurement technology improved. Humans moved from ropes and metal weights to sonar. Sonar works by sending a sound wave toward the seafloor, then measuring how long it takes for the echo to return. The longer it takes, the farther away the bottom must be. Then, between 1951 and 1952, another British ship arrived. Its name was HMS Challenger 2. This time, it was not there by accident. It had returned specifically to investigate the mysterious depth first first hinted at by the original Challenger more than 75 years earlier. Challenger 2 recorded a depth of roughly 10,863 meters. For the first time, the world began to understand the true scale of the discovery. The deepest place on Earth was not a mountain, not a cave, and not a hole in the ground. It was at the bottom of the ocean. That is why the area was named Challenger Deep, in honor of the two ships that started the story. But even those numbers were not the end of the mystery. In 1957, the Soviet research ship Vityaz announced a reading of 11,034 meters. Later, other American and Japanese expeditions produced slightly different numbers, and there was a problem. Every expedition seemed to give a different result. Was the depth 10,860 meters, 10,920, or even deeper than that? The answer is that Challenger Deep is not a perfect hole with one easy point to measure. It is a complex area with multiple deep basins, and sonar measurements can be affected by the speed of sound in water, temperature, salinity, and the exact location of the ship. In other words, humanity knew it had found the deepest place on Earth, but it still did not know its exact depth. But there was an even bigger question. Could a human being actually reach it? On January 23, 1960, two men decided to do something no person had ever done before. American Navy officer Don Walsh and Swiss engineer Jacques Piccard. Jacques Piccard was not an ordinary explorer. His father, Auguste Piccard, was a scientist and inventor who helped design a strange vehicle called Trieste. It was not a normal submarine. It was a bathyscaphe, a deep-diving vehicle with a tiny steel sphere where two men suspended beneath a massive float that helped the craft stay buoyant. To descend, it carried heavy ballast. To rise again, it released that ballast. In other words, Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard were about to spend hours inside a cramped steel sphere, descending into a place where the pressure was more than 1,000 times stronger than at sea level. There was no emergency exit, no quick rescue, and if the hull collapsed under the pressure, there would not even be time to understand what happened. The Trieste began its descent. At first, there was light. Then, the light disappeared, and after thousands of meters, there was nothing outside the window except complete darkness. The descent lasted nearly 5 hours. As they approached a depth of around 9 kilometers, the two men heard something terrifying, a loud cracking sound. One of the outer acrylic panels had cracked. At that depth, even a small failure could mean death. But the vehicle remained intact, so they decided to continue, and finally, the Trieste reached the bottom. The depth recorded during the dive was around 10,911 meters. For the first time in human history, people had reached the deepest point in the ocean. But the surprise was this: the scene was nothing like people imagined. There were no giant monsters, no lost cities. When the vehicle touched the bottom, it stirred up the soft sediment, turning everything outside into a cloud of mud and marine dust. They spent only around 20 minutes on the sea floor. In the first reports, Jacques Piccard said he had seen something that looked like a flatfish, but that observation is still questioned by scientists today because an animal like that has never been confirmed at such an extreme depth. What was certain, however, was that the place was not completely empty. Something was living down there. After around 9 hours from the beginning of the mission, the Trieste finally returned to the surface. It was a historic moment, but it did not open the trench to humanity the way you might expect. In fact, the opposite happened. No human returned to Challenger Deep for another 52 years. Because reaching the bottom once is one thing, but being able to return again and again to study it is something completely different. That is where the age of robots began. In 1995, Japan sent a robotic vehicle called Kaiko to Challenger Deep. It reached a depth of 10,911.4 meters and filmed creatures living in the extreme darkness, including crustaceans and marine worms. A year later, Kaiko successfully collected sediment and microorganisms from depths greater than 10,000 meters. That was a massive moment because humans were no longer only looking at the bottom through a tiny window. They were bringing pieces of that hidden world back to laboratories. The samples proved that life could adapt to pressure almost impossible for humans to imagine. Below 6,000 meters, we enter a region known as the Hadal Zone, named after Hades, the god of the underworld in Greek mythology. There is no sunlight there. There are no plants, and there are no food chains like the ones we know near the surface. But there are organisms surviving on what falls from above. Remains, dead animals, tiny particles of food. the place is not dead. It is simply alive in a way that does not resemble our world. In 2009, an American hybrid robotic vehicle called Nereus reached Challenger Deep at a depth of around 10,902 meters. It worked on the seafloor for hours. It sent live video back to the research ship, and it collected sediment and biological samples. Nereus was lighter and smarter than older vehicles. It represented a new step forward, a machine capable of reaching almost anywhere in the ocean. But even machines are not safe in the deep. In 2014, Nereus was destroyed by pressure during a mission in the Kermadec Trench, another trench in the Pacific Ocean. And that reveals an important truth. In the deepest parts of the ocean, mistakes are not forgiven. Then, 52 years after the Trieste mission, a human finally returned to the bottom. But this time, he went alone. In March 2012, filmmaker and explorer James Cameron, the man behind Titanic and Avatar, descended in a specially designed submersible called Deep Sea Challenger. The vehicle was long and narrow, descending almost vertically. It reached a depth of around 10.9 kilometers. Cameron became the first person to make a solo descent to Challenger Deep. He spent hours in that black world, filming the seafloor and collecting samples. He described the place as flat, soft, and frighteningly quiet, almost like the surface of another planet. And he said he did not see any large fish. Most of what he saw were tiny crustaceans moving through the darkness. And that is an important point. Horror movies have made us imagine that the deepest place in the ocean is filled with gigantic monsters. But the truth is stranger. There are no confirmed giant monsters living at the bottom of Challenger Deep. The truly terrifying thing is that life itself found a way to survive in a place that looks impossible. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel, because the strangest and most dangerous secrets of our planet are not always in space. Sometimes they are beneath our feet, under 11 kilometers of water. In 2019, a completely new era began with explorer Victor Vescovo and his submersible Limiting Factor. The difference this time was not simply reaching the bottom once. Limiting Factor was built to return to the deepest parts of the ocean again and again, not as a one-time mission, and not as a near-suicidal adventure. On April 28, 2019, Vescovo descended to Challenger Deep and recorded a depth of around 10,925 meters. He returned on more dives, while his expedition collected increasingly detailed maps of the seafloor. Those maps revealed that Challenger Deep is not one single point. It is an area with roughly 3 deep basins. And with modern measurements, the most widely used estimate for its maximum depth is close to 10,934 meters, with only a small margin of error. That means more than 140 years after a rope and metal weight were lowered from an old British ship, we are still improving the map of this place. In 2020, the Chinese submersible Fenduje, meaning striver, reached a depth of 10,909 meters inside Challenger Deep. There were 3 people on board. They spent hours on the seafloor, proving that reaching the deepest point in the ocean was no longer limited to one mission or one country. Then came newer scientific expeditions, whose goal was no longer simply who can reach the bottom. Instead, the question became, what is down there? Why does it survive? And how can we protect it? In 2022, scientist Dawn Wright descended to Challenger Deep with Victor Vescovo to help collect high-resolution mapping data for Seabed 2030, a global project trying to map the entire ocean floor. And in 2025, major research from a Mariana Trench environmental project was published, based on Hadal sediment samples. The results were shocking. Scientists found thousands of different microbial genomes, and most of them had never been recorded in public databases before. In other words, in the deepest place in the ocean, there may be microscopic life forms we still know almost nothing about. But there is a painful side to this story. Humans reached the bottom before learning how to leave it clean. In crustaceans living inside the Mariana Trench, scientists discovered toxic industrial chemicals such as PCBs, chemicals that were banned in many countries decades ago. Other studies found synthetic fibers and tiny fragments of plastic inside creatures living in the deepest ocean trenches, including the Mariana Trench. Think about that. A place untouched by sunlight for millions of years has been touched by human plastic. That is the Mariana Trench. It is not a gateway to hell, and it is not a fantasy world filled with movie monsters. It is proof of the true scale of our planet. We live on its surface, we map streets, we photograph distant planets, we send spacecraft to Mars. But beneath the ocean, there is an entire entire world we still do not fully understand. Its story began with a rope lowered from a British ship in 1875. Then came a steel sphere carrying 2 men to the bottom in 1960. Then robots that brought samples back from a place where life should not have existed. Then humans returned and discovered that the deepest point on Earth was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of another one. And the real question is not what exists at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The real question is, how many other worlds are still hidden beneath the waters of our planet?